From Highline Guitars, and you're watching another episode of From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up where I left off in the YouTube live stream that I did earlier this week. Now, if you got a chance to watch that, what I did was I applied a water-based aniline dye to the top of my Dragon guitar. And the reason I did that was because in, I think it was episode 83, I demonstrated how I did the inlay, and several people asked what was going to happen to the color of that inlay when I put a dye or a stain down over the top. And I figured instead of typing up an answer to that, what I would do is shoot a live stream video of me actually applying the dye to the surface of that guitar so you could watch it happening as it was happening. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to demonstrate everything that I was going to do to that guitar because applying the dye requires a dry time of about an hour. So what I did instead was I promised to post photos of the process as it was occurring on my Facebook Highline Guitars page, my Twitter Highline Guitars page, and my Instagram Highline Guitars page. And I went ahead and did that, but as it turns out, there's actually quite a few people who don't do the Facebook, Twitter, Instagram thing. They subscribe to me on YouTube, but they don't do the social media stuff. I can't say I totally blame them, but for those folks, I wanted them to have a chance to see how that project has turned out. So in this episode, I'm going to kind of fill you in and update you on where I took the Dragon guitar once that dye had dried. So let's jump in and get started. Okay, so if you didn't get a chance to watch my live stream, what I did was I put down some water-based aniline dye on the top surface of this guitar because a lot of people were asking me what was going to happen when I put dye over the green inlay. Was it going to change the color? And as you can see, really more of what it did was it shifted that bright, almost neon green color to more of an olive green and just darkened it a little bit. And that was really kind of the effect that I was after. And I sort of knew going into it that was what was going to happen. Whenever you work with a product like this and do an approach in this manner, I think it's a good idea to experiment on scrap wood to really get a feel for what's going to happen. That way you won't be caught out, with any surprises, especially if you're building a guitar for somebody else. But, as I said, I wasn't able to demonstrate everything that I was doing or going to do in that live stream because it would have taken too long. It was going to take about an hour for the dye to completely dry. So what I did following that live stream was I gave it about an hour or so to completely dry. And whenever you're applying like a water-based product like this over wood, you can tell it's dry by just touching it. If it feels cold and clammy, it's still wet. And once it feels like it's bone dry, then you're good to go. But then once it was dry, I lightly sanded the top surface of that wood. And what I was trying to achieve was to sand all the dye off of the closed face grain on the surface of the wood. And that would leave it in the open end grain, which is what forms the stripes in figured maple. And that's only because the end grain that forms that figure is more absorbent. It's sort of spongy and it really sucks the dye into it and it goes in much deeper. So you can sand and it will remain in those areas, but you'll sand it off of the surrounding harder face grain. So once I did that, I decided to go ahead and mask off the edge of the maple where it meets the mahogany. And the reason for that was because I wanted to put down the brown dye on the mahogany itself, but I didn't want to re-dye that edge. So I masked it off, I applied the dye, let that soak in and dry, but I didn't go back and sand it off because I wanted the dye to be full strength on the mahogany. Then what I did was I had to seal in the dye so that it wouldn't reactivate when I started to handle the wood, or when I started to apply my next round of clear coats. So I just sprayed some Crystalac sanding sealer, and this stuff works really great. You can also use anything that you can spray onto the surface to seal it, like the water-based sanding sealers. You can also spray a light coat of lacquer. You could grab a can of Minwax polyurethane, their fast dry polyurethane, and just give it a quick once over, and that's just going to lock that dye in place so that it won't come up. And once that was done and the sealer had been allowed to dry, I then applied some Aquacoat clear wood grain filler over just the mahogany. I masked off the maple again and then just applied it over the mahogany, and I apply it using it's just a small rubber squeegee, and I just sort of trowel it across the grain. And I usually will put about 2-3 coats on. And what you'll find with these water-based products is they don't necessarily fill the grain up and the pores up level with the surface. They'll still shrink down a little bit, but what they will do is they'll plug the pores and they'll plug the grains so that it won't continue to soak up finish. That way, when you start to apply your final top coats, regardless of what it is, they're just going to quickly fill up those the remaining recesses in the grain and the pores so that it comes level with the top surface. And speaking of top coats, what I chose to do for this is one of my favorite approaches to top coating, and that is, it's my own oil varnish mix. And what it consists of is about 2 parts polyurethane, 1 part boiled linseed oil, and then a couple of drops of Japan dryer. And I'll keep some mineral spirits handy, and I might add a little bit just in case the stuff is too thick. It just depends on the situation, but usually in most cases it's just the poly and the boiled linseed oil. And I'll wipe it on the surface, wipe it very quickly on, and then get a clean rag and wipe off the excess. And you're thinking you're wiping it all off, but you're not. You're leaving a very thin film. And I do that to the entire surface of the guitar, and then I'll let that dry, and it usually takes about 8 to 10 hours before it's dry to a touch. So if I'm lucky, I can get 2 coats on a day, and I'll do probably about 4 coats, and then I'll let it dry for 24 hours. Then I'll go at it with some 400 grit sandpaper and just dry sand it to kind of take off some of the high spots, some of the dust nibs and things like that, and just kind of get it down smooth again. Then I'll continue to apply that varnish, another 4 coats over 2 days, let it dry 24 hours, and then I'll sand it with 800 grit, which gets it even smoother. Then I'll apply again another 4 coats over 2 days, let it dry 24 hours, and then for the last coat, I'll take what I have left of my varnish mix and I'll add in some of the mineral spirits to really thin it out, and I'll wet sand the entire surface with 1500 grit wet dry sandpaper, and then I'll wipe it down nice and dry, being extra careful not to leave any rag marks. And the end result is just, it's a incredibly smooth, silky, buttery smooth surface with just a very slight satin sheen to it. So that's where this project is going to ultimately end up. And I'm also doing the control cavity cover at the same time, so that's going to go back here, and that should look pretty cool once that's done. And I've also started work on the neck with the finish, and I applied the dye, the brown dye, sanded off the excess, and you can see the Highline logo there. And now I'm applying multiple coats of that varnish mix, and I'll build that up and I'll apply it the same way as I do the body, and that will give me that it's an incredibly smooth finish on the back of the neck. And then on the fretboard, later on, I will put the marker dots in and then sand those down smooth. And the only thing that I'll put on the fretboard will be just a thin application of boiled linseed oil. So, and then that will be ready to put the frets on it, and then I'll be ready for final assembly. So that's pretty much what I've been doing this week, and that I think will conclude this episode from the Luthier's Workbench. So who knows what I'll talk about in the next episode. There may be more of an update on this. I have been thinking of some tips and tricks ideas that I want to kind of go over, some things that I know you've never thought about. So stay tuned and have a great week, and we will see you in the next episode.